It's not a thank you tour, not with the Russians back on the offensive after London and Paris. Ukraine's president in Brussels to rally support, painting the pitch for weapons as a battle of values. We'll ask about the timing and significance of Volodymyr Zelensky's second trip abroad since Vladimir Putin's invasion nearly 1 year ago. Is Kyiv ready for the crucial test ahead on the battlefield? Is Europe ready? Once vocal about keeping those channels of communication open with Moscow, the likes of France and Germany are now all in. If Ukraine loses or if the war drags on for years, what consequences for the rest of the continent? And as the UK starts to train fighter pilots, as the Germans greenlight tanks, we'll look at the latest from the battlefield and a war where the Ukrainians have pluck and foreign backing, but face an enemy that outnumbers them 3-1 and has an arsenal of its own, using its soldiers as cannon fodder at times. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Volodymyr Zelensky's European tour. Joining us from Brussels, Bruno Lettet, Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund think tank. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good evening.
She's a former political officer at NATO. Samantha de Burden is Associate Fellow at the Chatham House think tank. How are you?
Good evening.
With us as well, Georges Kuzmanovic, President of La République Souveraine Party. What is it? The Sovereign Republic Party.
Yes.
Welcome back to the show as well. And from Warsaw, we say hello to Maria Zalkina, Research Fellow at the London School of Economics, Director of Conflict Studies at the Ukrainian think tank Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation. Good evening.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Far from Brussels, at the other end of the continent, Russia's offensive may have already begun. The US-based Institute for the Study of War examining satellite imagery that confirms minor advances in Luhansk province. Much too soon to say if it's significant, but further south around Bakhmut, those months of relentless pounding taking their toll on Ukrainian soldiers. It's a report by partner station France 2, read by Leo McGuinn.
In Bakhmut, there is only one road left that allows access in and out of the city. For the time being, it's used mostly by Ukrainian armoured vehicles and ambulances. But it's a route that the Russians are trying to cut off. On the ground, Ukrainian troops are pessimistic about the situation.
The situation is very difficult for us. The Russians are surrounding Bakhmut.
In order to rest, soldiers take shelter underground. In this basement in the city, troops rotate between the battlefield and safety. It's a small space for the hundreds of men it holds, their faces marked by exhaustion and anxiety. Some are sleeping, others are preparing their exit back to the front line.
The Russians are so numerous. They look like ants advancing while pushing us back. It's hard to keep our soldiers alive and to hold on psychologically.
The medical team evacuate injured and dead soldiers every day, a job that takes a toll.
Helping injured soldiers is the hardest thing psychologically, but the worst is when you're no longer on the front line. When you're here and you have time to reflect, it's hell.
Soldiers rest for 24 hours before returning to combat. The Ukrainian forces are facing Russian fire from multiple sides as their troops advance from the north, south and the east. This recent footage filmed on the streets of Bakhmut shows that the city is now a war zone. Despite increasing Russian pressure, Ukraine has no plans to give up Bakhmut without a fight.
Samantha de Burden, has the offensive on the Russian side begun? There seems to be signs that they are pressing harder in several places.
Well, I would say it's been going on for quite a few weeks now, and it is intensifying. And one of the reasons why it's intensifying is that more and more men are getting to the front. The Ukrainians have described some days where for 10 hours in a row there has been relentless advances of men, one after the other. They come, they fall, other men come behind them. We're not seeing a big full-out offensive yet like what we saw in February 2022 when you have tanks and massive formations coming in from every side. But there is an intensification of the fighting, particularly around Bakhmut. And President Putin is now putting a lot of pressure on his generals to have some kind of victory by the 22nd of February, which is 2 days before the anniversary of the war. Because on the 22nd, he's going to be addressing the Security Council. He's also planned a big sort of event in Moscow, a patriotic event. The next day is the 23rd of February, which is the day of the defenders of the motherland. So he needs something to show for those days. So far, Bakhmut seems to be the prize he's aiming for.
Maria Zolkina, could Bakhmut fall in the coming days?
Actually, Russians tried to capture Bakhmut for almost 9 months so far, and this is not the biggest city in the Donetsk region, that part which is controlled by Ukraine. So at least as of now, we don't see that Ukrainian forces are being withdrawn or they are preparing to be withdrawn from Bakhmut. And until they are sure that there is another defense line which is well equipped and well prepared, we will not see any withdrawal from Bakhmut from Ukrainian side.
Right now, the ground is frozen. What happens when there's a thaw?
If the ground is frozen?
Right now, it's frozen in many parts, but what happens when it gets warmer?
The fightings will be a bit slower, but you know, in Donbas, namely in part of Luhansk region and in part of Donetsk region where the fights are going on, weather didn't have so significant influence on the battlefield. So in Bakhmut, for instance, itself, or in Solidar, or in Kreminna in Luhansk region, the fights didn't depend actually on whether it's warm or it's just conditions are deteriorating for the both sides to organize both offensive or counteroffensive. But in the hottest spot on the front line, weather is not the factor number one.
Which brings us to the topic at hand. Bruno Lété, why did Volodymyr Zelensky choose now to go after that December visit to the United States to do a tour of Europe?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it was logic that he went first to Washington. Zelensky wants to win the war, and the United States delivers most of the weapons. But now, indeed, the time is right to come to Europe, especially to Brussels. Now, Ukraine not only needs to win the war, but also needs to start thinking about reconstruction and redevelopment. So the European Union, of course, supports Ukraine in that sense. You know, there's already thinking politically about how to fund and give money for that. So it was important for Zelensky to come here, also to kickstart this process of reconstruction. So that was indeed an important point to make. The timing was just right to be in Brussels.
The timing was just right. And your thoughts on this, George Kuzmanovic? For you, what's the significance of these visits to London, to Paris, to Brussels?
Well, we may face a bad situation for Ukraine. In fact, we don't know exactly what is going on. And of course, Russians are pushing very hard. We may consider that it's already a 6-week offensive on all the front, and they are pushing and testing the Ukraine reserve. And I think that, unfortunately, they're killing a lot of Ukrainian soldiers. We have all this wave of Russians. Obviously, it's quite different. They're using a lot of artillery. They have from 3 to 8 times more artillery. And one of the big problems are the shelves, the ammunitions on the Ukrainian side. We had early this week Ukrainian officers saying that they don't have 82 and 120 millimeters mortar shells, and not enough. I mean, to use on Russian soldiers, and that's not the only problem.
So time is on Russia's side, is what you're saying?
Yeah, because the big problem of the Ukrainian army is that they have an army which is the material of this army is mostly Sovietic, and they received already a lot of help. Everything that Europe had, especially in Eastern Europe, as Soviet material, T-72 tanks, artillery, shells, ammunition, everything was sent. We already asked to Colombia or Brazil, who refused to send their Soviet ammunitions and Soviet weapons. And the problem is that you have to replace that, and an army is a system. It's a coordination of weapons, it's logistics, it's a specific maintenance system, and we have, well, this will come to an end because the reserves are ending, and they're building ammunitions and Soviet weapons on the Russian side. So all of this has to be replaced. And the problem is the difference of maintenance systems, of weapon system, of radar systems. And it's already hard, I think, for the Ukrainian staff to coordinate all these different weapons, and they will have more different weapons. So I'm not saying it's a good thing, but on Zelensky part, it's logical. He's asking more weapons because he's seeing the reserve of weapon and ammunition going down quickly.
Yeah, to really put some perspective on the ammunition problem in terms of the kind of the heavy shells that are being used, Russia is sending around 20,000 shells a day onto Ukrainian positions. France produces 20,000 of these shells a year. So even if the West, the European Union, be it individual countries, wants to give as much to Ukraine as Ukraine is asking for, there is a production problem in the West. The West does not produce the Soviet-type ammunition that the Ukrainians have been using, and the West has not been producing weapons for a long-drawn conventional war for years. So there is a real supply issue on the Western side, beyond all the political considerations that we all know about. And Zelensky also knows this situation. So things are looking difficult.
And in London, it's complicated. You're very right, because in London, you had the strong support of the Prime Minister. But the general of the commander of the UK staff said, we have one day of ammunition for a full war in the UK. And you cannot produce weapons and ammunitions like that.
Okay, so there's one NATO country that has the economy of scale to match Russia, and that's the United States. But of course, this time Volodymyr Zelensky was not in the United States; he was in Europe. So what is this trip about?
Well, there was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal that actually said that this trip was really organized sort of on the fly and quite a last-minute decision, that when Charles Michel was in Kyiv last week, he sort of said to Zelensky, you've got to come to Brussels, there's going to be the European summit on the 9th of February. And then Zelensky realized if he goes to Brussels, he has to go to London because the UK is the biggest provider of weapons to Ukraine after the United States. Whether or not this was organized on the fly is another issue. The kind of the hurried preparations of his visit to France does kind of give that impression. But he's coming to speak to his major donors. He's managed to get his tanks, but he realizes that the tanks are not going to be enough, and that the tanks without aircraft are not going to be as effective as they could be. He knows the difficulties that his troops are facing on the ground, facing the Russian army. And he knows that without even more help from the West, it's going to be very, very difficult to hold those positions.
What is certain this Thursday, if you were an EU leader in Brussels, a surefire vote-getter, was to have your picture taken with Ukraine's president. Cue the family photo at the European summit. Notice behind him is Viktor Orban. He doesn't seem to be applauding, but Zelensky was once again the star. Maria Zolkina, your thoughts on the optics of this trip?
So this trip was both politically and technically very important to Ukraine. So first of all, it's not just about the weapons, which is of course important, because now we are entering a decisive phase of this war, because Ukraine is gonna try to liberate another portion of temporarily occupied territories, and for that reason, Ukraine is needed specific weapons. And speaking, by the way, about ammunition, yes, Russia is still shelling about 20,000 shells per day, but this is because Russia is out of ammunition. And now, because previously they shelled like about 50,000 per day. And now when Russia shells about 20,000 and Ukraine shells about 10,000, it's more or less comparable in terms of, situation on a specific hotspot on a battlefield. So Ukraine needs to secure military support for this counteroffensive this year and to repel Russia's awaited from our side offensive and other assault on Ukraine. But most important is to make this support sustainable both politically and economically, because there will be elections next year to the European Parliament in US. There is a political landscape that should, admit that the security challenges and security threats coming because of Russian invasion of Ukraine, they are not going to disappear tomorrow, and military industries, which didn't, in none of the EU or NATO member states, which didn't produce enough number of weapons, they have to admit the fact, again, that either to help Ukraine or to secure their own defense capabilities for the future, they will need to reshape defense industries in their countries and start producing more, at least to increase their own capacities.
Yeah, the political aspect is important. Volodymyr Zelensky at the European Council getting that hero's welcome, the same one he got earlier in the day at the European Parliament. There was less about weapons and more about shoring up support for Ukraine joining the EU family someday. Zelensky telling lawmakers how the war has rekindled pride in Europe and its values.
This total war, which Russia has now unleashed, is not only for territory in one or another part of Europe. Its threat lies only in the fact that there is a dictator with a massive stockpile of Soviet weapons and supporting weapons from other dictatorships, in particular from the Iranian regime. To be able to wage this war, the Kremlin absolutely, cynically, consistently, step by step, year by year, destroy what we see as the basis of our Europe with you.
Now that's very political, Bruno Leté, talking about the undermining there of the EU. It seemed to be even a nod, and he turned often to the right, the more Eurosceptic side of the chamber during that speech. To the fact that you have pro-Kremlin support amongst many of the fringe parties in the EU Parliament. Do you agree with Maria Zolkina that this is a lot about what happens in the months and years to come inside of the EU itself?
I mean, look, today Brussels rolled out its best red carpet, but let's be frank, that's not why Zelensky came here. We just talked about, time being on Russia's side. Well, Zelensky came to Brussels exactly to ask the Europeans for time not to be on Russia's side, because we actually right now allow time to be on the Russian side. Zelensky came here for more weapons, accelerated EU membership, strong sanctions. This was a very concrete message with big stakes for Ukraine. I did not see today that the Ukrainian president went home with concrete answers. Yes, of course, European Union cares about symbolism, and symbolism matters in politics. But I didn't see the real concrete announcements for what the Ukrainians truly care about.
Well, let me ask you this, Bruno: is the other shoe going to drop during this summit when the 27 leaders discuss a new round of sanctions against Moscow?
Well, I mean, the 10 package is now being negotiated, and the 10 package will come. There will be sanctions probably around the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, it's very hard to come up with new sanctions. Probably it will be some watered down, negotiated formula. I think the EU will principally look at closing the gap on some of the sanctions that don't work effectively. I mean, actually, Russia has been fairly successful here and there to avoid sanctions. So the EU will concentrate on that. But we won't see the hard kind of tough decisions that Ukraine was hoping for. I don't see this happening.
Like what?
Well, I mean, there are diamonds, for instance, as a demand from Ukraine. There's still a lot of diamond trade between Russia and Ukraine. Let's be frank, there's still energy trade between Russia and Europe. Ukraine would like to see this differently. Of course, the trade of energy has decreased significantly, but it's still there. So there are many elements, of course, and Ukraine has its right and its interest to demand that. The European Union, of course, also needs to make sure everyone agrees and has its own interests. So it's the balance that needs to be reached.
It's a difficult balance. And before Brussels and after London, Zelensky paying a surprise visit to Paris. Samantha de Bendern there talking about how a lot of this seemed a little impromptu at times. Here he had a three-way sit-down with the leaders of France and Germany. France and Germany, once upon a time, guarantors of those failed Minsk Accord truce agreement deal with Russia. In an interview with French daily newspaper Le Figaro, Zelensky praising Emmanuel Macron for going all in. Quote, "He's changed for real this time," said Ukraine's president of his French counterpart. Macron, though, still quick to keep an eye on the day when Russia and Ukraine will have to sit down together and sue for peace.
La Russie ne peut.
Russia can't and must not win the war. As long as it continues to attack Ukraine, we will continue to provide military support to preserve the country and its future.
He goes on to say, though, that there has to be a view towards a proper peace deal when he's speaking there. Maria Zolkina, your thoughts on Emmanuel Macron and what his street cred is like these days in Ukraine?
In Ukraine, so there was a serious, concerns there because of previous, messages which were heard from Macron about negotiations with Russia. But as soon as it became absolutely clear for both French and German and any other leadership that the price for this kind of negotiations is territorial concessions of Ukraine and restrictions on Ukraine's sovereignty, like, for instance, some kind of restrictions on military and defense capacities of Ukraine and its foreign policy aspirations towards EU and NATO. So all these messages which were present at the first phase of this war, they started declining. And as of now, I think we can say that leaders of at least whom we are seeing on the screen are on the same page when it comes to impossibility of territorial concessions and restrictions on Ukrainian sovereignty. So that kind of peace is not considered anymore as a peace.
Let me ask you, Georges Kuzmanovic, in your view, has Emmanuel Macron's messaging evolved or have his policies changed in the last year?
I think as many times on different topics, his policy changed. Maybe he got pressure from the United States, and we regret it. France has always this specific position because we have the nuclear weapon and we have a chair on the Security Council of the United Nations. So we have a specific voice, especially in Europe. And that was the goal of the goal, to have a voice between the two superpowers, Russia and USA. And we need such a country who will bring people to peace, because that will be the end. There won't be endless war with a country who has 6,000 nuclear bombs. So you have to come to an end.
But Emmanuel Macron said that last night. He said we're going to have to at some point look ahead to the day. Of course,
this is obvious. You cannot invade. It's Montgomery who said in '62 the first rule of war is not don't march to Moscow. So yeah, of course there won't be a war like the World War II, because it's impossible with Russia, because they have. USA has nuclear weapons. So you have to find a peace deal. And we Europeans, we are not going that way now. So we're pushing, we want to fight Russia with Ukrainians' lives. I'm not sure this will end very good for Ukraine, because once again, Russia, and obviously they receive support not only from Iran.
So are you saying we should not be supporting Ukraine after its territory has been invaded?
We should understand what is supporting Ukraine. If Ukraine ends up with the loss of 30% of its territory and 300 young men dying on the front, it won't be a big support, and there will be. I think Ukrainian will be. It will be very fair from them to ask to give us the bill, because we didn't help them. The fact is that everybody believed in the beginning that Russia will win everybody, in 2 weeks. No, Ukrainians resisted. But on our side, we believe that we will kick a Russian economy in 1 month or 2 months, but it didn't happen. So Russian economy is strong, and they won't be defeated on that side, so they have the time to continue war. And I'm not sure that on the economic side, we can support a long war.
Samantha de Bender?
I think President Macron's mind has changed about Russia. I think in the beginning of the war, he wanted to incarnate that France that's just been mentioned, which was a sort of a go-between and the voice that could speak to Russia. And a number of things happened. He first of all, he saw the human rights abuses that have taken place in Ukraine. He saw what happened in Bucha. He also saw the tone of President Putin. He heard the threats that were being made. I mean, you do not threaten to use nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are a dissuasive weapon, but you do not start threatening them lightly. And this is what President Putin was doing. And he realized that this is not somebody with whom we're going to be able to negotiate in order to get peace in Europe. Now, I think we all around this table agree that we want peace. But what does peace actually mean? So let's imagine a scenario when the West stops supporting Ukraine and, as you rightly said, 30%, and I think it would be more than 30% of its territory will go. And Russia will have shown that nuclear blackmail actually works. Because I have a nuclear weapon and because I threaten to use it, I can do what I want to my neighbor. Is this going to bring peace and security in Europe? I don't think it is. The Balts, the Poles are going to be on their toes. The Ukrainians will not stop fighting, so you're going to have constant instability and war in the center of Europe. And there'll be a message that will have been sent to all the world that if you have a nuclear weapon, you can do what you want. In terms of nuclear proliferation, it is an extremely dangerous message to send. And yes, if the West stops helping Ukraine now, and at that point, I completely agree with you. Those 200 or 3,000 men who have died, because we don't know the figures on the Ukrainian side, but they're probably as much as on the Russian side, if not more, they will have died for nothing. And there's only one way that this war will end is when Russia decides that it does not want to continue taking up another country's sovereign territory. And the idea that by stopping arming Ukraine, we're going to bring peace to Europe, I think is a complete misconception. The West had an attitude to Russia from the very beginning that, oh, we'll let Russia do what it wants in Crimea. We'll let Russia do what it wants in Georgia, because it's not going to really cause war in Europe. Russia thought it had bought Europe. It had bought our leaders by inviting prime ministers to be members of gas companies and oil companies. It had bought up the whole of the city of London. It had bought us on a cheap gas. So it thought, okay, Europe will kind of complain a bit, but I'll be in Kyiv in a week and then we'll all forget about it. And he made a serious miscalculation. One is that the Ukrainians were prepared to defend themselves, and two, that Europe was prepared to defend Ukraine, because Europe is not defending Ukraine here. Europe is defending peace on our continent. So I think that we have similar objectives. We just have different ways of going around them.
If you remind Liz Truss, when she was prime minister, she was the first one who said this craziness, I'm ready to push the button, even if it ends the humankind. You remember that?
Liz Truss was prime minister for 40 days.
She was prime minister,
and there's many reasons why she's not prime minister anymore.
England has a nuclear weapon, so crazy people say crazy things. We have on both sides. So, and I think that unfortunately for Ukrainians, they are used. This war on the ground is a secondary part, is a secondary of a more massive war, that economic one that is ongoing between the BRICS countries led by China and Russia to fight the US dollar hegemony. That's what we are here. And the only thing that will happen, and the only thing that Washington cares about, is not to lose the US hegemony with the dollar. And that's it. And if this costs the life of 1 million Ukrainians, they will push it.
Maria Zolkina, your thoughts?
In December, we're predicting that that kind of a discussion will, continue in some of the European capitals. And we put a specific provocative question into one of our nationwide representative public opinion polls in Ukraine. It was, what should political and military leadership of Ukraine do in case the Western support, military support, will be significantly decreased or even stopped? And 60% of Ukrainians said that we have to fight until we have at least something to defend our land. And this is the choice of Ukraine. That's why we consider this conflict absolutely different from the global perspective that this is the battle between U.S. and China and plus Russia, exactly because for Ukrainians, it's the war in order to defend the very right for existence, not only of Ukrainian state, but for Ukrainian people. Let's have a look what's going on occupied land. So numerous mass graves are discovered, tortured. Dozens of cases were registered both by Ukrainian law enforcement bodies and prosecutor office, as well as international investigation companies authorized by UN, by the way, regarding the tortures, kidnapping, deportations, and all other war crimes and crimes against humanity. And we have to be frank that if someone wants to have peace at the price of Ukrainian territory, to be sold out to Russia and to appease Putin for another couple of years, not more, because then he will move another time for Kyiv, for Lviv, and for the entire Ukraine. So we are going to selling Ukrainian people. Is it that kind of European policy which should be based on? I doubt that. But regardless of this kind of discussion, Ukraine is going to defend itself because we have the very idea that this is our state, our land. We have capacities. We have surprised not only entire world, but Ukrainians themselves.
Well, the panel pointing out how the EU is much more in sync now than it was a few months back. And we saw that this trip by Volodymyr Zelensky begins in London, ends in Brussels. Not everybody's thrilled that in the middle, the Ukrainian president spent the night in Paris.
Guardi, francamente mi è sembrata più inopportuno l'invito a Zelensky di ieri.
I found the invitation from Zelensky yesterday more inappropriate because in this matter, I believe our strength is in community and unity. I understand internal political issues and favouring one's own internal public opinion, but there are times when favouring internal public opinion risks being to the detriment of the cause, and this seems to me to be one of those cases.
E questo mi pare che fosse uno di quei casi.
Bruno Lette, does Italy's prime minister, who is staunchly against Vladimir Putin, I should point out, does she have a point when she feels like, hey, the other 25 are left out if it's just France and Germany dealing with Zelensky?
Well, I think jealousy is inherent to politics sometimes. Look, the Italian prime minister has a right to have her opinions. What matters most is what President Zelensky thought. I do believe that the trip and the destinations of the president were very meaningful. London made sense because UK is one of the main weapon suppliers of Ukraine. Paris made sense, and let's also remember it was not only President Macron there was also Chancellor Scholz present. But so Paris made sense because Germany and France define EU policies, so it's an important meeting. And Brussels, of course, well, the heart of Europe. So perhaps the Prime Minister of Italy has her points, but it made sense. The road trip of Zelensky made sense, in my opinion.
Samantha,
no problem.
Yeah, I think that you have to view these two trips differently. That Zelensky's trip to Paris was very much about bilateral or trilateral relations. And one has to remember that in terms of defense and in terms of the weapons that have been given to Ukraine, EU member states are actually behaving as sovereign countries and making their own sovereign decisions. These aren't decisions that are being made totally at an EU level because we do not have an EU defense, unfortunately, at the moment. And there are a number of other issues. First of all, his personal relationship with President Macron. He remembers the fact that Macron received him in the Élysée in 2019 when he was a candidate to the presidency. There's the fact that his relationship with Macron needs to be repaired because there had been that little hiatus when he said, oh, I think he's changed his mind, and he really has now. I mean, that's the kind of thing that, when a relationship has been going bad and you say that, it's because, okay, you really want the relationship to work now. So I think it was very much a personal thing. And Scholz, it was also very much because of how Germany has completely switched its whole foreign policy orientation and given the green light to the Leopard tanks. So this was, I think, personal visits. They were bilateral visits, and the visit to Brussels is more a visit to the European Union as a whole.
Maria Zolkina, in that interview with Le Figaro, Volodymyr Zelensky saying relatively the same thing about Olaf Scholz that he did about Emmanuel Macron, that for Germans, it takes a long time to make the pivot, particularly for historical reasons. Is that how Ukrainians see it?
Exactly, because at least the expert community was, seen as a disadvantage of Ukrainian and German relations when Germany was not ready. I mean, not Germany generally, because there was a tough discussion even within German government about standing or not standing there. But it was mainly about social democrats' position and position of certain part of German society, which was not ready, for this kind of a huge step towards Ukraine, but this obstacle was overcome. And knowing very well what's going on in Germany, and I know that this is a huge step which Germany has made in comparison to how it perceived Ukraine and Russia. So starting from the volunteer refusal of Germany from a pipeline send oil from Russia to Germany, and ending with breaking all the rules for Germany itself in sending heavy weapons, and a decision of sending Leopards to Ukraine. This is a huge step, and this is how actually the security and defense policy of specific countries are changing during a time. The problem is that these changes have to be made a bit faster, because otherwise the price is the safety of Ukrainian people.
Yeah, let's talk about how fast things are moving. The last time you were with us, Zsolj Kuzmanovic, it was before they had green-lighted those Leopard tanks, the Germans, and you were saying it's just going to be a drop in the bucket. More pledges have come in since. Is it going to have an impact?
We'll see. Mrs. Zolkina is right. I mean, we have a country with people who had merely no weapons, no tanks, no plane, no nothing, no international support, and they defeated, after 20 years of war, they defeated the First Army. It was the Afghan people, so everything can happen in a war, and especially if you receive weapon and support from other countries. But once again, the game changer with Germany was not discussion of Scholz or anything, or values of Europe or anything. It was the destruction of the Nord Stream. That's it. And yesterday, you had the article of Seymour Hersh, the great journalist, American journalist, who discovered the My Lai massacre. He was the one who spoke about the Abu Ghraib issue. He said it's not the only one. That's a U.S. operation. Yeah, and if it's a U.S. operation, it's an attack directly against
he
our
quoted
European...
one anonymous source as saying it was the U.S. and Norway.
Yes, as he did with the Abu Ghraib. But we'll see. But imagine if it's true. It's an attack against Europe and against Germany, our industries, who are moving to the United States. I mean, it's normal for Ukrainian to fight for their war. It's also normal for France, for Germany, and for the people to fight for the interest of their own people and not to be economically completely destroyed with this war that is, I'm not sure, led in a very smart way by the Americans.
Well, the Americans are actually hesitating very much in supporting Ukraine in this war, and that is the big
Jeffrey
fear.
Sachs recently said the complete contrary.
Jeffrey Sachs is not the president
one among
of the United
many,
States.
with George Kennan, with Kissinger before, with Mersheim.
Samantha de Brendan.
Yeah.
Even Kissinger changed his mind, sorry.
So I'd just like to if we can just go back to some of the things you said about the Russian economy. The official Rosstat statistics agency has come out with figures of, for instance, automobile production minus 68%. The pharmaceutical industry is completely collapsing. Rosstat again came out with month-on-month figures for the budget deficit for January 2023. It's the worst since the 1998 crisis. The Russian economy is not doing that well. It is now suffering from the fall in gas and oil prices, and it will continue to suffer that. One thing I do agree with, however, with you, is that in terms of munitions production, there is going to be a problem for the Ukrainians, because the Russians are temporarily running out of munitions, but they will continue to produce munitions because they have oriented their whole economy towards a war economy at the expense of everything else, from social care to schools to health to roads to infrastructure to absolutely everything. There was a gas explosion today in Novosibirsk because of the terrible way in which buildings are maintained over there. So I think we're going to see a lot more about the Russian economy in the coming weeks. And in terms of the United States, the US president has a big battle on his hand because he has a lot of internal problems that need the financing that is now being spent on this war in Ukraine. He is also fighting a battle. And you spoke about hegemony.
And he has China as well.
Against China. So personally, I would like Europe to be independent and not depend on anybody. But if we have to choose between having help from the US or being under Russian or Chinese control, I know very much what I prefer. I prefer the kind of Europe where you and I can sit opposite a table, have completely different ideas, and neither of us will be shocked when we walk out of here.
No, we prefer Europe, I think.
Let me just, one final point from you, Bruno Leté. We played earlier that clip of Volodymyr Zelensky appealing to the jolt in EU pride that we've seen as nations band together in this standoff. Your thoughts on how it's looking going forward, and the words that the U.S. President Joe Biden said in an interview with public broadcaster PBS that his was a firm commitment to Ukraine.
Look, there's no doubt that everyone wants to help Ukraine. It's just that, some countries think a little bit differently about it. I think right now in Europe, we have two clubs of countries. You have one club of countries in the EU that really want Ukraine to win the war, but that also means to defeat Russia militarily. And then you have another club of countries in Europe that are more interested in a peace settlement, which probably also means to make a deal with Russia. So as long as Europe is not united between those two camps, I think we will see still a lot of diplomacy going around. And maybe last point, if I may, of course, it's easy for a country like France and other countries to have the luxury to think about peace, because, of course, the United States is playing a very big role in the security and delivery of weapons in Ukraine. I just wonder how, the policy of these countries would be if the United States would not play the role that it does in the security of Europe. Perhaps we would see something very different.
It's the final word for now, but I want to thank you so much, Bruno Leté, for being with us from Brussels. Maria Zolkina in Warsaw, Samantha de Bentern, George Kuzmanovic, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.